Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Real and the Rare. My name is Scott Morgan Roth, the Motor City Madmouth, along with my co-host Xavier McKnight. Xavier, how you doing tonight?
Doing well, Scott, and I hope you all are doing fine. I hope that everyone out there is remaining healthy and safe as we continue to go through these very trying times right now. I said on the last broadcast that we did, and I'll say it here, this is a temporary situation. We all just have to continue to remain patient and do the right things. And just always remember that tough times don't last, but tough people do. And we're all going to get through this thing together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, but I got to tell you one thing, Xavier. This quarantine stuff is for the birds, and unfortunately, there are a lot of birds stuck in a lot of cages. But yeah, you're right. It's something. I have a feeling, though, we're in for a real battle this time because we're dealing with what we consider a unknown enemy. And with all due respect, we're seeing a lot of fatalities, and this doesn't seem like it's getting any easier. But I'll take your optimism to the bank, and can only hope and pray that it continues that way. So. Anyways, you have a pretty interesting storyline about a documentary that's probably going to be released a little bit earlier than ahead of schedule. Much of this attributed to the sports drought or lack of content on national TV. Why don't you go ahead and take off with this, Xavier?
Yes, Scott. We learned earlier this week that ESPN would be releasing their 10-part docuseries, or at least the first two parts of it, about the last dance that is better known as Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls and their last season of their dynasty in the 1997 to 1998 season, And, you know, it definitely makes sense that they're doing this right now. Everyone is stuck at home, and radio hosts, television hosts, people need content to talk about. And this is a team that generations who were able to watch them, generations who didn't get to watch them, but they're so involved in the history of basketball and they love the game of basketball that we're so intrigued by them. Scott, Michael Jordan, when I was in the first grade, I checked out my first book in my elementary school at that time. I had been checking out books at the public library as well because my parents got me into reading very early throughout my life. But when I was in the first grade, I went to Middle Ridge Elementary School in Covington, Georgia. And the first book I checked out was a biography of Michael Jordan. And, Scott, I remember checking out that book at least 8 times throughout the remainder of my years when I was at Middle Ridge. I was so intrigued with Michael Jordan. I was so intrigued with the game of basketball, the Chicago Bulls, the NBA at such an early age that I credit Michael Jordan a lot for my love for the game of basketball. And I know I'm not the only one in my generation who feels that way. I'm one of those who, my memories of Michael Jordan, and I actually do have a memory of Michael Jordan actually playing basketball. Unfortunately, it comes with Michael Jordan being on the Washington Wizards, not the Chicago Bulls. But it's okay because Michael Jordan still has some highlights on the Washington Wizards as well, but he will always be known as a Chicago Bull. And ESPN is they're going to start releasing this documentary on April the 19th. The documentary was originally slated for June, but because we are all quarantined right now, everyone, unless you are an essential worker, you are quarantined to your homes, you're stuck there, or at least you should be. And if you love basketball and you love sports, this is going to be some very entertaining content. Scott, all I think everybody needs to know before I actually chime in on this is this documentary series was actually supposed to originally come out last year in 2019. Huh? ESPN pushed it to 2020 because they wanted to get even more context with this docuseries. And I am excited, and I just can't wait.
Well, first of all, Xavier, did you know that I saw Michael Jordan play in the 1982 Final Four in New Orleans?
No, I did not. Would you like to share some of those details with me?
Yeah, it was unreal. I was a 19-year-old guy with a lot of long hair and knew Bourbon Street pretty well. In New Orleans was the first time I went to a Final Four and a 60,000 seat venue. I would later on in my career interview Gary Bender in Phoenix, who called that game with Billy Packer, and it was incredible. Obviously, I think one of the best Final Fours ever when you saw Dean Smith defeat John Thompson and you had Jordan Worthy, you had Patrick Ewing, Eric Sleepy Floyd, and so forth. It was a great experience. And then I later went on to see Michael Jordan face my Detroit Pistons and cover the Pistons at the time. And there's no question I would always be partial toward Michael Jordan over LeBron James all day long. And, the Bulls had to learn the hard way, just like the Detroit Pistons had to take their lumps against the Boston Celtics when the Bad Boys era began. And, again, it's about growing pains if you're going to win a championship. You have to, it happens in stages. It just doesn't happen that quickly. And as was the case with the Pistons, they overcame the Boston Celtics. They lost the final series to the Lakers, came back and beat the Lakers, and then went on to win another one. But Detroit had to get over Boston. Chicago had to get over Detroit. And, Detroit had their number for a while. Then Michael Jordan, obviously, his legacy began after they did get over that hump. So, Michael Jordan's undoubtedly one heck of a player, Hall of Famer, and I have nothing but the utmost respect for Michael, the way that he played the game and the fact that he made so many players around him better. So.
Yes, and you bring up the Bad Boy Pistons and the Celtics of the 80s. Scott, I wasn't alive for this period of time, but just to what I see through the eyes of history and the NBA and through basketball, you tell me if I'm right on this or if I'm not. Would you consider that entire era of the Bad Boy Pistons, the Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, Dennis Johnson led Celtics, and the Showtime Lakers, and Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls, would you consider that entire era the golden era of basketball? Would you say that that was the apex of where the NBA was absolutely at its best? Because we know it's not there today, despite what they try to sell us on.
Well, yeah, after 1979, it sure did. Remember, the league was on tape delay, Xavier. Beforehand, it was going broke. I remember many years ago when it was on tape delay, I used to work at a place called the Highland House and used to get off at 11:30 at night on the weekends, and I was watching NBA Finals game. But once Larry and Bird and Magic Johnson went over to the NBA, there's no question about it. Today's version of NBA basketball is like playing patty cake baker's man is what it is. Where, our version of it when I was watching it and covering it in its prime was like a boxing match. Everybody had to earn every bucket, and defense was heavily emphasized, and, games were closer, and you had to earn your keep in order to be able to ascend to the top of that era. So there was a lot of great basketball. You had, not only do I talk about Larry and Magic Johnson, but you had Dr. Julius Erving. Charles Barkley would later come on board. We know about Jordan. Dennis Rodman, a hard-nosed player. I couldn't stand Bill Laimbeer, but can't downplay the fact that he was a physical player. Rick Mahorn, Kevin McHale, Dennis Johnson, you alluded to him. So you have a lot of great players, and these guys played hard. And you know what? I can tell you, when every series was over, they shook hands. And I'll never forget one of the classiest gestures that I ever saw was when the Pistons finally overtook the Boston Celtics. Kevin McHale and Larry Bird went out and said, go out there and beat the Lakers. And they said, you know what, you represent us and you represent us well. You tell me if that isn't class, Xavier McKnight, and then I'll tell you what, I'll take my gray beard and turn it brown. It was class. You know what I mean? But then again, I can't say the same about the Pistons and the Bulls, that when they went down the way they did, but they felt disrespected in that series, and that's why they didn't go down with a little bit more dignity when you had the changing of the guard. But yeah, it was a great era of basketball. You had a lot of great coaches back then. Pat Riley for the Lakers. You had Chuck Daly for the Pistons, Casey Jones for the Celtics. Lots of great coaches during that time frame. So yeah, I think that to me is unquestionably, Xavier, a proud era of NBA basketball. No doubt about it. Because I certainly don't like what the game has become today. Too much talk, the NDL, the National Drama League, and, I'm just sick and tired of a jump shooting league versus the old. There was a commercial, Xavier, about E.F. Hutton. When E.F. Hutton talks, people listen, and you have to. And I think there was another commercial about you have to go out there and earn it. And nowadays, I don't think these players appreciate what those guys laid out for them in the past.
Well, no, Scott, I definitely agree with you because, you gave some names. There's some great players, some great coaches. Well, I'm glad you brought up the name Casey Jones. I'm really glad you brought up his name because the Celtics coach that gets mentioned the most, as it should, is always Red Auerbach. Red Auerbach, the architect of the Boston Celtics of the late 50s all throughout the 60s. He actually had a hand up into the Boston Celtics organization up until he died in 2007, I believe. But Casey Jones, his name is not brought up enough to me for what he meant for those Celtics teams in the 80s as well. And it should also be noted that Casey Jones was also a player with the Boston Celtics organization early on in his life as well. So he was a well-rounded Celtic as well. But, I'll share with you a few of my basketball heroes who I grew up watching who, I feel that they played the game the way that it was supposed to be played before, like you said, we came into the National Drama League and all the jump shooting I'm with you on this. When I was younger, I found the three-point shooting intriguing, but now I just can't stand it because the game was meant to, you go down to the hole and you throw it down on somebody or you have it put back in your face. I grew up watching Shaquille O'Neal and Tim Duncan and Tracy McGrady and Allen Iverson and Kobe Bryant and Dirk Nowitzki, and, they all had different styles of game. And late in their career, they started to all transition outside of Allen Iverson because he didn't play well into the previous decade. But all of those guys, they started to transition into what the league is today. But I'm always going to remember those guys for what they were in the early 2000s and the late 1990s, even though my only memories of them are in the 2000s when it was a competitive league. There was hand-checking. There was actual real defense being played. You took it to the hole. The mid-range game was actually a real thing that was still involved in people's playbooks, which for some reason is not anymore today because of the three-point shooting contest, and everybody wants to now go out there and see how many more threes we can make as opposed to the other team now because of the Golden State Warriors dynasty. But, I feel that I grew up in that last era of where it was real basketball as well. Scott, I'm probably one of the last few people of the millennial generation who actually grew up going to go play basketball sometimes at the park as opposed to going to play in the gyms. So, I understand exactly what you're saying right there, and great appreciation for all those players and those coaches. Can you just share with us what it was like to actually be there in the moment covering the Bad Boy Pistons and Michael Jordan's Bulls as they were coming up? Because what I don't think everybody actually understands when it comes to those Bulls is Phil Jackson wasn't always coached it. When the Bulls were first coming up and Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant were in their first few years, Jordan was Jordan. He was a scoring machine. He played defense. Great player. But those other players had not developed around him yet. And he also did not have the coach who he had won all those championships with in Phil Jackson. His coach was Doug Collins. I mean, can you just explain to our viewers, what it was like first to just even be there and cover that level of greatness on the floor all at one time with Jordan and Isaiah and Joe Dumars and the head coaching matchup first with Doug Collins and the late, great Chuck Davis?
Yeah, you know what? Before I do that, though, you mentioned a lot of good players, and the players that you just specifically mentioned are guys that could have played in that era. To me, Shaquille O'Neal could have played in that era. I loved Allen Iverson, Tim Duncan. Those are guys that, to me, again, you know what? They don't get the credit that they deserve, but all the guys that you mentioned could have played during the Bad Boys era, and, in the 80s, and I think they're just unbelievable players. Now, to answer the second part of your question, I am so glad you brought Doug Collins up, and I actually worked with Doug when he was the Pistons head coach, and I marvel at Doug because he's the most intense individual on the planet. Don't lose sight of the fact that once upon a time, Doug Collins was on the 1972 Olympic team that should have had a gold medal, but they were robbed because of that controversial situation against the Soviet Union at the time. All I can tell you is this: he does not get enough credit for doing the dirty work, where Phil Jackson inherited a very good basketball team. So, yeah, it was great. I mean, you had a lot of personalities then. I used to talk to Chuck Daly a lot during lunch because the coaches used to eat with the media. It was a very friendly environment at the Palace of Auburn Hills. And I had my favorites in the locker room. James Edwards was a favorite of mine. Dennis Rodman, I loved him. Him and I became good friends for a period of time. I had a good working relationship with Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, and a bunch of other guys. So, Again, these guys here played basketball. They emphasized team first. They didn't emphasize individual. When Mark Aguirre was acquired by the Pistons for Adrian Dantley, a lot of the key Pistons, including Isaiah, his best friend in Chicago, said, "This is the way we do things here. Don't screw it up. We know that you had some issues in Dallas. This is not how things are done here." And you know what? Mark Aguirre had to adapt quickly. He did, and as a result, he was part of the solution, definitely not creating the problem. So, yeah, it was a great, they emphasized defense, not offense. Maybe it was an ugly brand of basketball at times, but you know what? I've always said you have to outscore the other team, but to do that, you have to defend them as well. They always say, Xavier, this defense creates offense, right? Right? Well, back in that era, that's exactly what it did. I don't see anybody playing defense here today. I really don't. I don't see, you let your play do the talking for you. And that's what made it so great. All those takedowns that McHale, Lambeer, Bird had, remember watching, I don't know, again, you talk about programming nowadays being compromised. I enjoy the challenge of trying to find content for the South Florida Tribune. We don't get it a lot nowadays, but we get our fair share amount, and we focus on the broadcast. But therefore, because of the quarantine, I've been forced to stay at home a lot more to watch the digital things. I remember seeing the Lakers and the Celtics had a documentary on ABC, ESPN. I loved it, how the Celtics dominated the Lakers back in the 60s, a little into the 70s, until the Lakers did get a few titles. But again, you appreciate the rivalries. On one of our broadcasts last night, I always said that one of the best rivalries in pro sports was the Celtics and the Lakers. I mean, sure, there were other ones in the past, but again, I'm talking about a rivalry, Xavier, that goes more than just an era. I'm talking about a generation. So, yeah, it was a good time to watch basketball. I'm very turned off about it. I don't get into Miami Heat basketball. Every now and then when the Pistons go down there, I'll see it. But Miami seems like it's over an hour and 10 minutes away with tolls included, but I don't mind. If there was a decent brand of basketball and the game was played with hunger, desire, instead of all the talking, perhaps. But, I love covering NBA basketball back then. I really did. I think it was a great time in the sports world to do it. So many great players. The one thing was so good about it back then is when you had super teams, you built them through the draft and you acquired key trades. You didn't have guys switching one team to another because they all want to play with each other. You didn't have to worry about fraternizing. These guys literally hated each other, Xavier. They really did. Now, did they talk much during the off season? Did they have lifelong friendships? Maybe later on. But nowadays, I find that, you think that Larry Bird and Magic Johnson would have played patty cake baker's man back in the day? No, but they later became friends. Right, they later became friends. It was good to see them become teammates together on the Dream Team with Charles Brown. That was great, and Chuck Daly was the coach, or what do we call it? The guy that runs the trains here, but the locomotive, But nevertheless, he was the one in charge of it all. So that was just a marvelous era to watch it. Nowadays, it's just, I'm turned off by the whole league. I really am. But I loved it back then.
I definitely agree with you on those sentiments as well. I mean, Scott, I'll break it down for you like this. When LeBron James first came in the league, he was one of my favorite players to watch. Of course, I was younger, and this guy was so big, strong, and fast, and younger. But, and within the past decade, the game has become more about politicking and, as you said, fraternizing and becoming friends. And it's taking the competition out of the game. And it's like he's just taking a back seat for me as far as being a favorite at this point. I won't deny the fact that he's accomplished some great things and he had a great Hall of Fame career. I won't take that away from him, but he's no longer my favorite player to watch. And it's kind of been that way for a few years now. I was excited to see him win a championship for Cleveland because I was excited for that fan base because,
right.
You talk about going 52 years without winning a championship in a professional team sport. That's a long drought to go through. So many things that happened in the world from that period until the point to where they had won that championship in 2016 But that was just about it. Because, I mean, you can make the argument that there were politics included in them winning that championship, too. Draymond Green being suspended for Game 5 and so many other things that took place there. But, I mean, that's another story for another day, and I won't get into it. But, you know, talk to me a little about, because you spoke about the Bad Boy Pistons and the Bulls, their little playing in 3 consecutive Eastern Conference Finals.
Right.
But with the Bad Boy Pistons documentary on ESPN, the 30 for 30, and it's actually my favorite ESPN 30 for 30 documentary. I've lost count on how many times I've watched the documentary, but I can sit there and I can watch it over and over and over again, because when it first came out in 2014, I didn't exactly have a liking for the Bad Boy Detroit Pistons, because they had been viewed as the bad guys, and they were bad for the game of basketball. And when I sat there and I watched the documentary for myself, the conclusion I walked away with for myself was these guys were one of the best things that ever happened to the game of basketball, because they helped bring the competition out of everybody. And they helped bring the best out of everybody. And, you know, it wasn't about being friends. It wasn't about fraternizing.
Right.
You know what I mean? You're talking about guys on the Bad Boy Pistons. I remember seeing a clip where Bill Laimbeer saw Joe Dumars getting ready to help Dominique Wilkins off the floor, and he slapped Joe Dumars' hand away. Said, "We don't do that here." You know, and people can look at that and they can view it as, well, that's not having very good sportsmanship. No, it is good competition.
Right.
It's absolutely good competition. But, you know, talk to me just a little of what it was like to watch that young Chicago Bulls team develop throughout the late 1980s before we start talking about their dominance in the 1990s.
Well, let me get back to one point you made about LeBron James. One of the biggest catastrophic errors he could have made was the decision, okay, because I think his one championship in Cleveland meant more than the 2 in Miami. And they had visions of 4, 5, 6 championships, and how did that turn out? They were enemy number 1. Dallas took care of that the first time, and they only had a couple championships out. Now, let's not lose sight of the fact that LeBron James has won 3 titles and has been in the finals, and he's 3 and 6. So, you know, as good of a player as he is, you know, he still only has 3 rings, although 3 rings is better than nothing. So, but 3 and 6 in the finals isn't anything to feel great about. Obviously, he's a one-man act for a couple of them. But yeah, that was the temperament of the Bad Boys. It really was. They hated everybody. And now the one thing that you don't lose sight of is I believe that James Edwards actually lives in the Detroit area. I also believe that John Sally does. I don't know for sure, but my sources in Detroit say they do. So they bonded with the community after their playing days because they're smart. Anytime you have a player that performs so well in a community, you want to stay there because you're trying to concentrate on life after basketball. And you talk about the local brand there. Another guy that I know, Robert Porcher, in South Carolina. I think he's out of South Carolina State, had a good career with the Lions, and he's in that community. But yeah, there's no question that era was great. But they had a very strong, they were very strong from the coaching staff in. They really, really, really were. And when you have these guys, but that was Bill Laimbeer's way of doing things. And, you know, from a legacy standpoint in terms of what he did, you know, his presence, that was great. Now, later on, it would probably cost him because he never got any coaching opportunities because the same bridges that he burned playing, none of them wanted anything to do with him after his career. And he was a bad PR person in a sense where he didn't get along with the media. And to be able to coach in the NBA, you have to deal with us all the time. You really do. But in terms of a championship pedigree, you know, I had an incident with Bill Laimbeer many years ago, Xavier, over at the Boston Garden. I had torn my ankle skiing on Christmas Day, and I was in a cast, and I was there for 2 games, Celtics games, one of which the Pistons, and Laimbeer makes a wise crack and says to me, you know, ask Dennis Rodman, why are you talking to him? And I said, listen, Bill, just because I can't go ahead, just because you don't have to make a car payment doesn't mean I don't have to make mine. And Dennis Rodman was an ally and a friend of mine, and I used to go to him all the time, and he was always there. And I had a lot of people that I went to. And you know what? Dennis Rodman came to bat for me. He said, you know, Bill, why don't you keep your mouth shut and let the man do his job? And you know what? Bill Laimbeer didn't say another thing. He kept quiet, went in his locker, didn't say a darn thing. So they were strong, good people, and the way they were in the locker room transcended how they played on the basketball court. And, Chuck Daly used to tell you, and that's what I do with a lot of our people here at the on the Sports Exchange and South Florida Tribune Broadcasting Network. Chuck Daly says, if you don't go ahead and practice hard, you're going to fight for your minutes, okay? I don't play favorites no matter how good you are. And you know what? That's what I do here. And as a result, these guys had to be competitive in practice so they saw the floor when they did. And he maintained that sense of consistency throughout, which is why Chuck Daly is in the Hall of Fame. So it was a proud era. And I got to tell you, here in my office at home, I have a piece of the championship floor that Bill Wickett gave me when he's the director of public relations for the Pistons. He said, Scotty, you deserved it. Here, take this as a gift from the Pistons to myself, and I'm very proud of it. I don't know if you're on Instagram, but if you are, I actually posted it up on my page, and you might want to follow me. If you're not, fine. If you are, I don't know. But I actually posted that photo up there, and I hope you get a feel. That's how special that era was to me. I would travel with them every now and then on the road, and it was just remarkable to be close to a team that not only was successful, but the core blue-collar values that they had in a blue-collar town was just unbelievable. It really, really was. I hope I answered your question to give you a feel for what that era was about, but I was very proud. Now, to answer your question about the Bulls, you know what, again, the Bulls had to take their lumps. They had to go through the Celtics for a while. They had to go through the Pistons. Doug Collins does the dirty work. Phil Jackson is a great coach. He certainly knows how to manage personalities, and that's why, what do they call him, the czar? I'm trying to remember what his nickname was. Do you remember?
It's the Zen Master.
The Zen Master, thank you. So, yeah, he knew how to blend those personalities, but Doug Collins did the dirty work. And, Phil Jackson showed, being the Zen Master, he was able to duplicate that out with the Lakers, and he has an awful lot of championships to show for him. But I have nothing but the utmost respect for the Bulls. But think about the Bulls for a moment, okay? They saw what the Pistons had. Did John Sally win a ring with Chicago? You bet. Did Dennis Rodman win a few rings with the Chicago Bulls? You bet. Do you think Jordan wins 6 titles without Dennis Rodman taking over for Horace Grant? No, because Dennis Rodman did the dirty work. He didn't care a lick about offensive production. He did not. He was more concerned about defense and rebounding, and that to me is a credit for what Dennis is all about. He did the little things that nobody wanted to do, and let the stars get the points, and he did the dirty work, and as a result, TEAM, 48-point Xavier, and that's where the parallels between the Bulls and the Pistons took place. And let's not lose sight of the fact that Larry Bird had a great blue-collar ethic. He had Kevin McHale, Dennis Johnson, Robert Parrish, and the list goes on and on. Now, I should point out another little historical thing. Bill Fitch preceded Casey Jones, and he was not a player's coach. It's okay to be hard on players, but don't get to the point where you're pushing these to a guy level where they're going to run you out of there, because even though the players run the asylum back then, they didn't quite run it as much, but you don't talk down to them. You have to respect these guys, which is where a lot of coaches don't do it. Like, for example, remember John Beilein not making it through a season with the Cleveland Cavaliers? You can't treat men a certain way as you can with kids. And Bill Fitch didn't have the people skills that Casey Jones did. But bear in mind, you alluded to it before, Casey Jones was brought up with the Bill Russells, the Red Auerbachs, the Bob Cousy's, and he knew what he had to do to let his guys do. You have to have faith in the people around you. I've learned that with my business model with you and the rest of the people at our company. You know what I mean? So if you bring a guy in there to do a job, you've got to give them enough room to do it, guide them where they need it, and be able to coach them as much as possible, but have confidence that they're going to do what they've got to do, which is why I love doing this broadcast with you. I let you talk about the subjects. We talk about what we've got to do, and it's up to you to make sure the show's interesting enough so that I can go ahead and make sure that I provide you with a old school perspective as you do a younger perspective, and that's why I have so much fun working with you as often as we get the opportunity. I hope I answered your question, though.
You definitely did, and I wanted to, before I go on to my next question, I want to allude to some things that you said there. Dennis Rodman, the greatest rebounder of all time, no hands down, no questions asked about it. One of the greatest defensive players of all time, maybe the greatest defensive player of all time. Not sure about that. There's been some great defensive players throughout the history of the game, but he's up there with them. And, I mean, these days you have guys like Draymond Green who like to make proclamations and statements saying that they're the greatest defensive players of all time. And I just want to say right now to our younger listening audience, if they are indeed listening listening to us right now, do not buy into the hoopla. Do not buy into the foolishness. Draymond Green is nowhere near the level of a Dennis Rodman, and he's nowhere near the level of some of the players who did not win an NBA championship, like a Reggie Miller and a Charles Barkley and a Patrick Ewing. Don't let the Charles Barkley jokes on NBA on TNT fool you. Charles Barkley was a great NBA basketball player. There's a reason he's in the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame.
Well, but I will tell you this, though. You know, Dennis Rodman didn't get in the Hall of Fame because of his tattoos, nose rings, and all that. But in all fairness to Draymond Green, and I've seen the guy play for as little as I watched the game, I think Draymond Green, with the technical fouls he gets and the hard-nosed play, probably could have played in that era. Now, he probably would have gotten flattened a few more times, but he's one of the few of today's players, Xavier, that I do believe could have played during that era because he's a hard-nosed basketball player. I can't say that about a lot of guys that are playing right now. LeBron probably could have because he's an exceptional athlete, but I find it hard to believe many of them can. But I would actually tell you that Draymond Green could have fit in that era. I really do, as crazy as it may seem. But again, you know, because he's a physical, intense player. He really could. I don't think Kevin Durant could have played in that era, though. I don't think Russell Westbrook could have played in that era just because they're scorers. But Draymond Green, I really think that he probably could have. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that's just a gut feeling, having seen a lot of basketball in my lifetime.
No, I agree with you on that because he's the guy that gets out there and he does the dirty work.
Right, exactly.
And if you're a guy that gets out there and you do the dirty work, you just about fit in almost any era that there is. I don't disagree with you on that. I'm just saying that, listen, him calling himself the greatest defensive player of all time, stop it.
Right. Oh, I agree there. Let your play talk. Nobody cares what we got to say. As an old friend of mine and mentor said to me, and he used to be on television a lot. He said, "Don't tell us about it, show us." And that was his catchphrase when he was on TV all the time describing sports. Don't tell us about it, just show us, okay? Let's go to the scoreboard. Let's go to the highlights. The highlights are going to be what they are. Even when you're doing play-by-play, and I haven't done any on TV as much as I would like to, I'd certainly love to be able to have an opportunity to do on radio. But let your play speak for itself. And there comes a time when you have to let the pictures and the words, if it's visual, tell the story. Don't tell the story for it. But yeah, that's where I have a problem with Draymond. But then again, Draymond Green is part of the 95% of the NBA population that all they do is talk. But at least in his case, his intensity and his style of play could transcend, but he needs to keep his mouth shut. Then again, I should probably say that about 95% of the players in the league, right, Xavier? Because that's the reason why the ratings have taken such a downfall. That's why the interest is probably at an all-time low, and that's why they're scrambling to find a way to get fans and media and whatnot interested in the game. You know, and the NBA has some serious issues there. I don't care about all the goodwill that the league has had during the COVID-19 crisis. Their problems stem deeper than that. They really do, and they better figure it out. And, you know, they can take all the positive publicity they can get now, but in the end, you know, when play does resume and reality sets in with them down the road, you know, I love David Stern as a commissioner. I really did. He wouldn't have taken a lot of the garbage in this day and age. Adam Silver's taken over the game. He's done what he's got to do. But to me, the best commissioner ever. I mean, I thought, I think David Stern, without a doubt, is the best commissioner that league could ever have had. And what can I tell you? I mean, was definitely classic. So.
Well, yes, I definitely agree with you on all of that there. Now, let's touch a little bit more on the Bulls here. And this time we're going to stretch it into the 1990s where all of that dominance took place. 1991 through 1993, the Bulls, their first three-peat there. 1996 through 1998, their second three-peat there. Of course, we know what happened in 94, 95. Jordan briefly retired from the game, said he needed a break from the game. The Houston Rockets, another team. And also, before I continue on this topic, I just want to say this as well, because we'll touch on this a little later on when you're ready to close out the show.
Sure.
But, I want to give a huge congratulations to Rudy Tomjanovich. He was elected to the Pro Basketball Hall of Fame this evening. Those results are expected to be announced tomorrow, but some information has leaked out that he is one of 4 people who will be inducted into this year's class of the Naismith Basketball Basketball Hall of Fame. And I just want to give Rudy Tomjanovich a huge congratulations because this is a long overdue honor for a well-deserving and well-earned coach.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I also want to point out the fact that David Stern did a great job, but Larry O'Brien did the dirty work. That's why he has a trophy named after him. But yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, that Tomjanovich deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. And guess what? He's in it, and he can enjoy it, and rightfully so. So continue on.
So, going into let's start with 1991 to 1993. Which set of those three-peat of the Bulls would you say are the ones that stand out to you the most? Is it Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Horace Grant, or is it Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman?
I'll be partial toward the second three-peat because he took the break, came back, and then the Bulls reloaded, and they were able to get Rodman, because I think Rodman is the guy that they had to take a chance. They had to bite their tongue and their ego because he was a fierce opponent for them, but they were willing to bring him on despite the baggage that he came with them in terms of psychologically. His play never suffered, so they had that locker room and that organization and that front office had to accept him, and Phil Jackson had to do an incredible job to make sure, guys, the guy did win. Let's accept him, and he'll make us all look brilliant. So don't get me wrong, the first three championships they won, they went ahead and earned them. They really, really did. Like anything they did, anything you earned back then, you earned it. But I think the second three was just as important, if not more so, because they did it when they were older, and they brought in Rodman. That was a gutty move for that organization, but it worked out well for them. What about you?
I agree. I agree with you on that as well, because let's touch on some of the other players who played on those first three championship teams there. John Paxson, B.J. Armstrong, Bill Cartwright, Stacey King. These were guys on the team that they had a role, they knew it, and they played very well in their role. But when you go to that second set of the three-peats, that's where you get the Ron Harpers. And for those of you who don't know about Ron Harper, you might want to go do your research on him, because Ron Harper was on his way to a Hall of Fame career before injuries derailed him and his athletic ability and his performance. But he was an absolute integral piece to what those Bulls were able to do in their second three-peat. Tony Kukoc, arguably the greatest European player not named Dirk Nowitzki, more than likely. Would you say that, Scott?
You know what? That's a great name to bring up. I think that Tony Kukoc, to me, was a guy that one of the pioneers of the European players that did make an impact. Yeah, no question about that, for sure. Nowadays, the European players you see a lot more. Well, it's too bad the Pistons got the wrong end of the Darko Milicic move, but that was their own fault. Joe Dumars should have taken Carmelo Anthony, and that's a mistake that haunted that franchise. But yeah, I agree. Tony Kukoc was definitely a guy who certainly was a big contributor there. And again, though, you have a coach that knew how to fit him in the lineup and got the best out of all of his players.
Okay, and now you have your other glue guys like a Steve Kerr, a Bill Wennington. One thing about the Chicago Bulls, they always kept great size and length on their team. They, whether they could perform to the levels of a Charles Barkley, a David Robinson, a Patrick Ewing, even a Rick Smith or someone like that, and Antonio Davis or someone like that, they always kept the size on their team and glue guys and guys who would come in and do the dirty work and who would do their job. They would play their role, and they play it well enough to continue to help the team win more championships. But that second team, that second three-peat, that stands out to me the most. That's where you get 72-10. That's where you get the 69-13 win Bulls, I believe, in 1996-97. If it wasn't 69-13, it was definitely 68-14. And, you have that last year, which this documentary is going to be focused on, those 97-98 Bulls. They won over 60 games themselves, or right at 60 games. But, what this documentary is really going to focus on is how it wasn't so easy for them to get that last championship because there were so many issues going on within the organization. Things were not going well with Jerry Krause and Phil Jackson and Jerry Krause and Michael Jordan. Scott, you were covering the NBA during that time. What can you share with us about what you were hearing just as a member of the media about what was going on in Chicago in the late 90s as far as front office issues and issues within Jackson and Krause and Jackson and Jordan, because Jackson almost quit on the team. Jordan almost was going to leave the team. You know, there is a huge chance that this sixth championship almost didn't happen. Now, we know for a fact that it did. There were a lot of things that played a role into that almost not happening.
Well, I got to tell you a funny Rick Smith story before I answer your question. I remember one time sitting in the Pacers locker room and I was talking to him, and when I had my tape recorder and I sat next to him, I felt like I needed a ladder to talk to him because he was that tall. 7'5", 7'6", and I'm like 5'11". So can you imagine how that turned out? So thought I'd bring that up since you brought the Rick Smith. What happened there was it's like any time you go through a situation where you've been together a long, long time, egos start to get in the way. You know, as we've seen with the New England Patriots and Bill Belichick and Tom Brady going, you know, at some point or another, it's time to go. And I think the only one who held it together was Jerry Reinsdorf. And the one guy I did not like, and I've never cared for him and never will, is Scottie Pippen. When Scottie Pippen had opportunities to make this his team, he couldn't rise up to the challenge. He was always, I don't know how he ever got voted into the top 50 players. I don't know how relevant that list is now. But Scottie Pippen, to me, is not in that top 50. And when you talk about the history of that league, no way. But like anything over the course of time, eras come to an end. Even Chuck Daly, after a while, never got along with Jack McCloskey, but they coexisted under Bill Davidson. So, there comes a point in time where, change is necessary, egos get involved, and that's what took place. But, those eras, that was a proud time. It really is. Egos are the key word. Because, everybody would have liked to in Detroit see Chuck Daly stay longer. Dennis Rodman went over the deep end when Daly left. And as a result, Dennis made out at the end, but it's just time, Xavier. That's what happens. Hey, one of my favorite TV shows over the years was Happy Days. And you know what? It was in the 50s, but when the decade ended, the era ended. So why am I bringing Happy Days up? Times just go on, and that's what you have. And as a result, it was a great era of basketball for Chicago. Has there been a lot of front office dysfunction? Yeah, there has been, but the Bulls definitely have a proud organization, and they were great for the NBA, and they were certainly great for that era. And a lot of teams were better because of the Bulls. They really were.
And, you brought up Scottie Pippen there. I've heard many stories about Scottie Pippen over the years. And, basically in line with what you just said there, if we were to add the players that have played in the league since that top 50 all-time list came out in 1997, he wouldn't be on the list.
Right.
We already know that. He would not be on the list. There are 20 to 25, maybe even 30 other players who have played since that time that you would probably put over him on that list. There are players in that era before that list even came out that you would put on that list over Scottie Pippen. But even more than that, some of the stories I've heard about Scottie Pippen is he's just not a very likable guy. He's just not a very likable person. And there were many times that Jerry Krause could have dealt Scottie Pippen, wanted to deal Scottie Pippen, but it was Michael Jordan that was holding that together.
Well, it is. Again, you needed a Batman and Robin, and as a result, Michael Jordan was Batman and Scottie Pippen was Robin. So, yeah, I mean, when you have two players that play well together, you try to keep them together. There's no doubt about that. But when Jordan left, you saw what Pippen's real value was. He didn't step up at crunch time. But, yeah, like anything else, eras are what they are. And anytime you're dealing with a locker room, especially one where you only have, that time you only have 12 players, you have to live with each other for the better part of 80 to 100 games all year, you're going to have certain personality issues, clashes, fights along the way. But in the end, you have to be all for one another. Now, you brought up Steve Kerr. I will say this about Steve Kerr. He's been successful with the Warriors as a coach, with the Spurs. He's won a lot of championship games, and the smartest thing he ever did was not take the New York Knicks job when Phil Jackson was there. But, again, Steve Kerr was a great basketball player and a great basketball mind, and as a result, you know, his legacy is he's headed to the Hall of Fame one way or the other, probably as a coach. I don't know whether his player accolades get him there, but wait for the Naismith to call him down the road. That's a name that'll definitely be coming up down the road. And listen, you want to talk about eras coming to an end? Greg Popovich, you know, if the playoffs were to start tomorrow, the Spurs would not even get in. So, but he had a great run, a really good run, 24, I think, straight playoff appearances. The Red Wings had 25. These things end. As hard as it is, Xavier, to deal with, that these things end, they do. But again, the Bulls to me represented the league well, and that's why I'm glad we're doing this thing before the documentary comes on, because once again, you've come up with another timely situation, which is definitely going to be great entertainment. And I do want to point out, too, for all you folks that are listening to the broadcast, that it is our responsibility here at the South Florida Tribune Broadcasting Network, the Real and the Rare, as well as all of our other shows, to provide you with the best entertainment possible. So when you have this extra time on, you know, feel free, and if you want to reach out to us, then feel free to email us at the South Florida Tribune Broadcasting Network. You can reach us at southfloridatribune@gmail.com. I will forward Xavier your questions or comments, and we'll get it in the social media before we close the broadcast. So again, you make up a lot of valid points. You really do.
Yes, and you know, I want to touch a little on Dennis Rodman here in particular, just for a second.
Sure.
You know, let's simulate into time just a little bit. We're going into the 1995 offseason now, and he's coming off of a brief stint with the San Antonio Spurs. Wasn't always the best person in the locker room, but his impact that he had on that team, which doesn't get enough recognition from me. You know, Scott, I'm before I even touch on the point of why I'm even bringing him up, I want to pose this question to you, and, you know, you just give me your thoughts on it.
Sure.
To me, Dennis Rodman and what he brought to the San Antonio Spurs, his presence, that championship pedigree, that hard-nosed, dirty work, doing whatever it took to win the game, making all those key plays that you don't see in a box score. I believe that Dennis Rodman helped propel David Robinson to going into a better level as a player. Because when Dennis Rodman arrived in San Antonio, David Robinson won his lone Most Valuable Player award.
Right. Well, what you have to understand, Xavier, about Dennis Rodman is that every team that he left, okay, they fell apart. The Pistons, when he left, fell apart. When San Antonio left, they fell apart. When the Bulls left, they fell apart. What does that tell you? Do I have to say much more about that? Do I?
No, you don't, because, I mean, this is a point that should be duly noted about the Dennis Rodman era in San Antonio before we touch on Dennis Rodman in Chicago. The Spurs did go to a Western Conference Finals when Dennis Rodman was the second in command of David Robinson. They lost to Hakeem Olajuwon's Houston Rockets because Hakeem Olajuwon, one of those great all-time players who does not get discussed enough. He is not brought up in that conversation enough, but that was a great team. He's a great all-time player, and the Spurs fell short against that team. But prior to Dennis Rodman showing up, the Spurs had not gone that far yet.
Xavier, do you remember who one of the coaches was for the Spurs before Greg Popovich?
Yes, Larry Brown.
Well, yeah, him. But what about Bob Hill? Do some research on that. Bob Hill, I believe, worked with Dennis Rodman. It wasn't an easy relationship for them, but Bob Hill, to me, was one of the finest basketball coaches ever. And if you do your research, maybe he didn't have a lot of wins. I don't know what his winning percentage was, but Bob Hill was a very fine, underrated coach. And he was with the Spurs too. So, yeah, but Larry Brown was there as well. But, do a little bit of research on that. But you'll find that, David Robinson became an MVP because, once again, Dennis Rodman did the dirty work. Tim Duncan, got Robinson over the hump because he had a superstar player. And how many superstar players come out of Wake Forest? Well, the one that got the Spurs, where the Spurs became a dynasty, and that was that guy called Tim Duncan. You ever heard of him? He could have played in any era, too. But again...
Yes, of course. I mean, as I said earlier in the broadcast, Tim Duncan's one of my basketball heroes. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he may have the most perfect career of any superstar in NBA history when you think about it, winning 2 NBA MVP awards, being a 15-time All-Star, the greatest power forward of all time, 5 NBA championships, 6 finals appearances, never missing out on the playoffs, and the only time he won less than 50 games in a season was the lockout-shortened season of 1998 and 99,
right,
when the Spurs won their first NBA championship. Let's just think about that for a second, Scott.
Sure.
Tim Duncan went through 2 lockouts in the NBA. In the 2011-2012 season, when the league was shortened to 66 games, and the Spurs still won 50 games that year.
Right. That
tells us something.
Remember one thing about Dennis Rodman. One of the few places he did not win a championship was with the Lakers, and I believe that was pre-Phil Jackson. If he had been with Phil Jackson, you might want to check me on that, but I'm almost certain that was pre-Phil Jackson. So that shows you the type of player that Dennis Rodman was. You know, wherever he went, he won, and that's why he's in the Hall of Fame.
Yes, I definitely agree with you on that, but let me pose my question to you.
Sure.
Going into the 1995 offseason,
yeah,
it's already being discussed around league circles that Rodman and San Antonio, that relationship more than likely going to come to an end.
Right.
Now, given the history of the Detroit Pistons and the Chicago Bulls during that era, they're just a few years removed from battling it out in the playoffs consecutive years in a row for the right to go represent the Eastern Conference in the NBA Finals. Did you ever think that Dennis Rodman would ever put on a Chicago Bulls uniform?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No doubt about it. And I felt that way because he's a true winner in every sense of the word. You know, Dennis Rodman wanted to go where he was. He didn't want to leave Detroit, okay? I believe he was traded out of there. So, yeah, it's not entirely possible for a player like him to go to a rival, especially if you go where you're wanted, and they wanted him there. And as a result, they won. So, no, that doesn't surprise me. It's one thing that they shipped him out. I don't like players going to other organizations because they're looking to team up with people, but trades are trades, drafts are drafts. So anything's possible. You know, did you ever think that Brett Favre would end up with the Minnesota Vikings, but he had to go through the New York Jets to do it? No, but it does happen. You go where you feel like you have the best chance to win and where you can play and maximize your ability. You want to leave on your own terms, however you end up doing it. We've seen in recent weeks that lots of great players who you thought would start their career one spot and would finish it have gone on to that are going to be playing for other organizations, most notably the NFL. Did you think Phillip Rivers would end up in Indianapolis? No. Did you think Tom Brady would end up going to Tampa? Did you think Jason Witten would go from the Cowboys to the Raiders? No, and the beat goes on and on. So, player movement is what it is. And I think while a lot of guys would love to stay in one place, it does happen. But it's one thing to join somebody. Although, hey, free agency gives you the right to choose wherever you want to go. And you have to respect the fact that some guys do it. Just do it in a dignified way. But no, it doesn't surprise me that Dennis went to the Chicago Bulls. He wanted to win. They wanted him. And they had to acclimate. And as a result, the Bulls are better because of it.
Yes, most definitely. I mean, winning 3 more championships, Dennis Rodman being the third guy there and all that. And as you said, and it's very important that we continue to emphasize on this, he was a guy who simply cared about winning and doing whatever it took to win. He didn't care about the offensive part of the game, as you said. I mean, you don't see that with a lot of guys in the league today, especially those who are Hall of Famers and just have that type of profile. And I mean, it has to be noted, I mean, especially in this last season in particular, Dennis Rodman was doing so much more than just playing basketball during this era. Scott, I was watching a documentary on the WWE Network just a few days ago with Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone and how they were involved in the World Championship Wrestling, WCW, with Hulk Hogan and Diamond Dallas Page. And this is around the time when these guys are still actually playing in the season and they're getting ready for the playoffs and they're getting ready for the finals. And, I mean, there's so much more that was going on with more than basketball at that time. And that leads me into my next question. Can you just talk about the star power of the Chicago Bulls off the floor during that time?
Sure, but I should point out to you, okay, that in this day and age, though, Xavier, we both know it, defense is a foreign language to these players. And that's why, I've always liked great defense. It's okay to have good offensive performances, but defense, I think, is unappreciated. The star power was what it was. Jordan was your star power, and they had a lot of other good players on that team, that certainly could get out there and, hey, listen, Phil Jackson's star power. Here's a guy that's the person, the conductor of the train, keeping it all together, right? So, star power goes when you have great players. That's all there is to it. So, they had a lot of strong personalities. And I'll tell you one thing about Chicago, and I've been there many times. If you win there or you're a big sports figure, you can easily open up a restaurant or whatnot, and they'll idolize you. If you want proof of that, how about Harry Carey, Steve Stone for a while, I believe. And who else has a bar out there? I think Mike Ditka's got one. So they'll recognize you in the Windy City. They will. So the star power in Chicago. And bear in mind, you only have one basketball team there. And you only have one hockey team, but then you have two baseball teams. And you have what? I think you have two baseball. You have one basketball, one hockey, and one football. So you'll be treated royalty in Chicago. You will. The star power was led by Jordan, of course.
Okay, and we spoke a little there about the Bad Boy Pistons, the Celtics of the '80s. One of the other teams I'll bring up in that conversation, two other teams actually, I'll bring them up. They never got to the Eastern Conference Finals during those last few years of the '80s per se, but they were hanging around, and those would be the Dominique Wilkins-led Atlanta Hawks and the last few years of Julius Erving and Charles Barkley as he was coming of age in the game, their Philadelphia 76ers. But those are the late 80s. Talk to me a little about the 1990s and the Eastern Conference, if you don't mind. Because one of the things that I always hear in particular about the Eastern Conference in the 1990s is it was a more physical, it was a more tougher, and it was a more competitive conference. Some of the teams I'll go ahead and throw out there, the New York Knicks, the Miami Heat, the Orlando Magic, the Indiana Pacers, and the Cleveland Cavaliers. So can you just go ahead and give me an insight on, the toughness and the physicality and what you noticed from those other teams in the Eastern Conference who were not the Chicago Bulls, just to help take us all through the hurdles that Chicago had to get through in their own conference?
Well, you got to remember, Pat Riley, I believe, was the coach later on for the Knicks. And Jeff Van Gundy, I think, was a very underappreciated coach. I think he really was. You had Patrick Ewing. Yeah, I mean, Julius Erving, you had Julius Erving and Charles Barkley. They just ran up against a buzzsaw with the Chicago Bulls. They didn't have enough of a supporting cast to be able to overcome that group. The Knicks certainly had I think they had, Patrick Ewing. I think Mark Jackson played there for a while. All these teams just simply didn't have enough. They had a lot of great players. I was certainly rooting for Patrick Ewing to win a title. Unfortunately, it never came to fruition. But the Bulls are just too much for anybody. They really were. I mean, the Miami Heat, they just joined the league, in the 80s, I believe it was, for a while. They're relatively new. Their dynasties began to create later in their existence. As Pat Riley came on board, Mickey Harrison still was their original ownership. So always great, stable ownership with Miami. But the Bulls were just a buzzsaw. They were far above everybody. They just were. And when they finally came of age and they matured, they were just simply unstoppable. It's nothing against the competition. The Indiana Pacers had Reggie Miller. They had Rick Smits. And then later on they had Larry Bird. And Rick Carlisle was an outstanding assistant for the Indiana Pacers until he went on to become their head coach as well. So I just think the Bulls are just too much. There's no reflection on the other teams. It's just the Bulls are just way too much.
And it should be noted that those Indiana Pacers of the 97-98 season, they were the only team in the Eastern Conference throughout the Bulls' reign of dominance who came close to knocking that team off. I'm going to speak about the Orlando Magic and what they did in 1995 in just a second.
Sure.
But I continue to emphasize reign of dominance because this is when the Chicago Bulls were actually winning championships. The Chicago Bulls were not winning championships in 1994 and 1995. And with that being said, Michael Jordan comes back to the game in spring of 1995. They run up against the Orlando Magic with Shaquille O'Neal, Penny Hardaway, and the Bulls' ex-teammate, ex-championship mate, Horace Grant. And they actually lose to that Orlando Magic team in the semifinals of the Eastern Conference that year. But they come back the very next year, that 72-10 season, with crew coach Rodman, Ron Harper, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and those guys being led by Phil Jackson, of course. And they beat the Magic in the Eastern Conference Finals. They actually sweep them out of there. Of course, you know, there's a 30 for 30 out there now about this Magic moment, speaking about Shaq and Penny Hardaway's Orlando Magic and how great they were at a young age. But towards the end, things just started unraveling. You brought up the word egos. That was another huge thing that happened down in Orlando with that team.
Right.
Shaq wanted to be the man. It seemed like someone else was in there trying to force Penny to be the man, from what the documentary teaches us. Shaq ultimately left and went and signed with the Los Angeles Lakers. 2 years later, throughout his entire tenure there with the Lakers, got to team up with a young star who was going to become a Hall of Famer in his own right. That would be the late, great Kobe Bryant. And we're going to speak on that as well as we prepare to end the broadcast in just a few minutes. But I want to ask you a hypothetical question really quickly.
Yeah, Kobe Bryant's one of those guys that could have played in any era, too. I would have loved to have seen Kobe play against those players. Oh, God. Kobe Bryant's just unreal. And he could have played, and he could have handled himself quite well back in that era. I'm glad you brought his name up. Go ahead, proceed.
Yes. So my question for you is, if Shaquille O'Neal doesn't go to the Lakers in 1996, and he actually remains with the Orlando Magic, and he continues to play alongside Penny Hardaway and that really good supporting cast that team had, because that team had a really good supporting cast on it with Dennis Scott and Nick Anderson and Brian Shaw. Horace Grant was still there at the time, being led by a great head coach as well, and Brian Hill, I believe it was.
Right, yeah. Good memory.
If that team stays together, do you still feel that Chicago wins 3 more consecutive championships?
Yeah, I still do. I do. I don't think Orlando had enough firepower. I really don't to sustain it. Could they have gotten the title? Maybe, but I don't think the supporting cast was nearly as comparable as some of the other examples that you mentioned. That's what I think.
Okay, yes, for sure. I definitely buy into that, because, as dominant as Shaquille O'Neal was from a power standpoint,
right,
at a very young age. Now, the younger audience, they probably remember the Shaq who bounced around from team to team late in his career and was always out of shape. And, he made an all-star game in his last few years in the league, but it wasn't the Shaquille O'Neal that I grew up watching. The Shaquille O'Neal I grew up watching was on the Lakers, and that guy was still big and powerful. He wasn't running up and down the floor like he was in Orlando. The Shaq that I'm referring to now was still running up and down the floor in Orlando. And as dominant as he was from a power standpoint, we saw what Hakeem Olajuwon did to him, or at least those who were alive during that time. We saw what Hakeem Olajuwon was able to do to him in the 1995 NBA Finals. It's just too much for him. And the Houston Rockets, as great as that team was, and they're an underappreciated team in NBA history as far as I'm concerned, what they were able to do. They were a deep team as well, but, we're talking about the Chicago Bulls here, that they had just a little more than those Rockets did.
Yeah,
the only thing they didn't have was a big man that could do the things that Hakeem Olajuwon could do.
Right,
but just from a standpoint of depth on the team and other supporting cast members, the Bulls had a little more than those Rockets did. But those Rockets did have a lot. But, I definitely agree with you there. It's just one of those questions that I've heard many analysts just ponder the question about throughout time. And I just wanted to get the take from someone who actually covered the NBA during that time period on, What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, number one, okay, again, getting back to my point, the Magic never had any resources to give Shaq the reinforcements that he needed to sustain it over a period of time. Again, could they have gotten the title? Maybe, but he ended up getting those with the Lakers, And I had an opportunity many years ago, I believe it was in '94 or whatever it was, when Shaquille O'Neal was on the Olympic team and met him over at the Palace of Auburn Hills. One of the most level-headed, nice superstars you'll ever meet. Really nice guy. And what you see on TV is what he's really all about. He's a guy with high character and integrity. So to answer your question, repeat the question, please.
Well, you already answered it, but I'll ask it again. Just
sure.
If those Orlando Magic had stayed together, could they have possibly dethroned the Chicago Bulls for maybe one of those championships?
No, I would say no. I really would. No. Because the Bulls were more balanced. They had average centers, okay? They didn't have the dominant center, but they had enough pieces around there where you'll get your rebounds one way or the other, but in the end, they could beat you so many ways. And the one thing that's better than a dominating center is being able to have a bench where you can go 8, 10, 12 deep, or at least 8 to 10 deep, where you have some of your centers that can pick up some garbage fouls, keep the physical play going is what you have. You know what I mean? You don't need the one guy that is your Shaquille O'Neal, and one guy that's way before you were ever born was Bob Lanier, who I wish would have won a NBA title, played for the Detroit Pistons and the Milwaukee Bucks. If you ever do your research on Bob Lanier, Don Nelson worked so hard to get him a ring with Milwaukee, but again, he ran into some buzzsaw teams with the Boston Celtics. So to have the dominant center, Shaquille O'Neal was a rare breed. He really was. And, but I don't think that would have made a difference. The Bulls were so balanced. I really believe that. Couldn't have hurt,
okay,
but
and with
didn't
that
make the
being
difference.
said, I'll just put it like this. I don't usually promote other networks on other platforms, but in this case, I'm definitely saying April 19th, ladies and gentlemen, if you love NBA, if you love basketball, if you just love competition, and if you just love greatness in general, have yourself parked in front of a TV for parts 1 and 2 of The Last Dance of Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls of the 1997-98 season. We know they're going to detail a lot more than just that season with that docuseries. I mean, it's a 10-part series. We know they're going to tell a lot more than just that season in particular. But as I said, when we first opened up this broadcast tonight, Scott, I cannot wait. I wish that the series was actually starting tonight. I mean, when I first learned last year that they were delaying that series for this year, I was actually pretty bummed out and disappointed.
Well, there's a saying in our business, Xavier, that there are times when you have to pull that card out of your pocket, and when you deal with a situation like this where you're in the media, I'm in the media, there comes a point where you have to do certain things probably more than you want to, and that's what I'm doing. I'm not scrambling. I'm just adjusting, and that's what they'll get some. It's good that they're going to be able to air these kinds of programs to give you an appreciation, because I think the one thing that can't get lost in everything is nowadays fans don't have the appreciation of the history of what sports is. Let me give you an interesting example. Once upon a time when I was covering the Detroit Tigers and the Tampa Bay Rays over in St. Petersburg over at Tropicana Field, a guy by the name of Mike Maroth did not know who Mickey Lolich was. And Troy Percival, you remember the name, I talked to him in the dugout and he said, "What? Are you serious?" Because Troy and I got along real well. I told Troy, the biggest problem you have nowadays is a lot of these guys don't even know the history of the game. He said, "Yeah, you're right." And I wouldn't be surprised if Percival went in the clubhouse and told him you need to read up. But that's just something that happens common. But it's good that anytime you can talk about the history of a sport, let alone a dynasty, then by all means, for crying out loud, you celebrate it. And there's no better time when the program... We're all scrambling, Xavier. I can't imagine what your network is going through to try to go ahead and get quality content on. But this is what separates the thoroughbreds from the standardbreds and the mules. This is when you know you're challenged to the limit to be able to make it interesting no matter what, without any excuses whatsoever. And you know what? I'm glad they're having this document. They couldn't release it at a better time. If the sports are ever resumed later on down the road, so what? You've got to do it. Every network is absolutely doing it, and kudos to ABC and ESPN, if indeed that's where it's being aired, for doing it. I think they'll get great ratings, and I think it'll be... I'm looking forward to watching it. if the situation presents itself. I'm glad they're doing it, and I'm glad that you decided to bring it on the real and the rare for sure tonight, because I think that'll give people a perspective about what they have to look forward to instead of what we're dealing with right now at the moment.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, it goes back to many things that you've already alluded to throughout the broadcast, and, I'll go ahead and say it myself. The biggest thing we hope for here with the Real and the Rare and the South Florida Tribune Broadcasting Network is that we are able to bring you some form of entertainment and some form of relief during these very trying times. We have people losing their lives. We have people losing their livelihoods. It's a very trying and challenging time for many right now. And, Scott, I'd like to thank you as well just for sharing, your stories and your knowledge, because, you actually covered these great teams that we are about to watch this documentary on in just a few weeks. So, I thank you for that, and as well as everyone else. And, Scott, you brought up one thing with the people not always acknowledging and appreciating the history of sports. I'm going to go one just a little deeper than that before I get to my last point on how we'll close out the show. People just don't have an appreciation for history in general anymore anyway. A few weeks ago, Kenny Rogers passed away, and there were many younger people who, not even teenagers, people who are 20, 30 years old, and they're like, who's that? And I'm 23, and I'm sitting there, I'm like, you don't know who Kenny Rogers is? You don't know who the man who is responsible for, you got to know when to hold him, know when to fold him, you don't know who that is? So, I agree with you on that statement 100%, but I believe it's just history in general as well. Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I saw some of Kenny Rogers' concert. I think he's one of the best singers of all time, let alone a country singer, and I certainly listen to him every time I can. I celebrate Kenny Rogers all the time. I have a lot of songs I'll listen to, and you know what? He's definitely one of a kind. Rest in peace, Kenny. Love ya. And I'm glad that at least the one thing about a vocal artist is that you can always hear their voice no matter what, because they certainly leave an incredible legacy behind. One thing about us broadcasters, you, myself, whatever, that when we pass on, hopefully there'll be enough people that can pick up these episodes that will always know what we sound like when we sounded at our best, for sure. And Kenny Rogers was great. I always loved the Carpenters, but I won't get into a music broadcast. Maybe one day we'll have some fun on the Real and Rare and talk about some artists down the road. But yeah, rest in peace, Kenny Rogers. You certainly decorated my life in a lot of those songs that you went ahead and sang, for sure.
Yes, for sure. Rest in peace to Kenny Rogers. And I also want to say rest in peace to Bill Withers, who passed away on last night, this morning as well. Responsible for so many great songs that have been sampled by so many other artists throughout the past few decades. Ain't No Sunshine, Lovely Day, in particular Lean on Me, which is a huge song that many people are making their own versions of right now to continue to keep everyone uplifted and encouraged during this time right now. So rest in peace to those two gentlemen, and rest in peace to everyone who has experienced a battle with this coronavirus, COVID-19, and they ultimately passed away because of it. Rest in peace to them. We send our deepest thoughts, prayers, and condolences to their families. As I already stated, it's a very trying and challenging time right now, and we can only just continue to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, please just continue to do the things that we know that we should be doing right now. If you can, just stay at home, stay clean, please don't go outside unless you have to do some really essential things. We're starting to see more and more states come out with a shelter-in-place order. Florida finally came out with their shelter-in-place order earlier this week. Governor Ron DeSantis came down with that order on Wednesday afternoon. And if you live in Manatee County in Florida like I do, we also now have a curfew that is in place. The hours between 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., you should not be doing any non-essential activities during those hours. If you do and you were caught, there will be a price to pay. But you shouldn't be doing those things right now anyway. But in particular with those hours, curfew's been put in place. So, we really hope that you all have had a great time with us during this show. I know I've had a great time with Scott this evening. We always have a great time.
Yeah.
And the way I just want to close out this show is simply by saying, once again, congratulations to head coach Rudy Tomjanovich on finally receiving his honor to go into the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. And also congratulations to Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, and the late, great Kobe Bryant. They will all be announced for the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. It's expected to come out tomorrow. Whether Kobe Bryant had passed away or not, these guys were going to go into the Hall of Fame anyway this year. They're all first ballot Hall of Famers. They had those types of careers. But congratulations to all of those guys. Well-deserved, well-earned. We all hate that Kobe Bryant's not going to be there in the presence and in the flesh to give us his speech. But, we have so many great memories of Kobe from what he gave us on the floor that we can continue to hold on to, and let's just cherish those.
Well, Xavier, you said a mouthful, and I'll say to that mouthful, GMTA, great minds think alike. You said a lot of things I want to say. I'm glad it came from you. Since we talked about the Pistons a little bit, I should point this out, that they used to play in a building called Cobo Arena. I think it's called the TCF Center. It got a sponsor name. And that building there that used to be the home grounds of the Pistons is now serving as a temporary hospital for COVID-19 people as well. So I want to bring that out to light. So meanwhile, as we close out the show, why don't you go ahead and let everybody know your social media information, and I'll conclude it with mine.
Yes, once again, ladies and gentlemen, you can follow me first on Instagram at XMCKNIGH22. You can follow me on Twitter at XTMCKNIGHII. Those two I's at the end are both capitalized. And you can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook just simply by typing in Xavier McKnight. I have not joined the TikTok train with everyone else yet. I don't plan on doing so, but if I do decide to make a TikTok, you all will be informed about that as well.
All right, let me promote us as well. You are listening to the South Florida Tribune Broadcasting Network. You can find me on LinkedIn at Scott Morganroth, and you'll find me at in Tampa, where I covered a Super Bowl there. I believe that's a photo I have on there. And Twitter, I have two accounts. One Scoop with 5 3s, so 33333. Count them up to 5. At Tribune South as well. The at Tribune South. You can also find the South Florida Tribune on Facebook. We have a Tribune page. Please like it. And you'll also be able to find us on Instagram as well, South Florida Tribune. So we have a great deal of followers that follow the broadcast. You can also find these broadcasts at www.southfloridatribune.com, and they go automatically up on Twitter, but we want to make sure that we certainly share them throughout, because, there may be some times where people can't listen later at night, but there's certainly the opportunity to go ahead and do it should you are able to find them. We also go through iHeart Radio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spreaker, and anywhere you can go ahead and get your podcast. So look us up, like us, subscribe, and download, and you'll be able to see our episodes as often as you want. So Xavier McKnight, I'll tell you something, my friend. You said a mouthful tonight, but a lot of the things you said were unbelievable, and I think a lot of people can appreciate the time and effort that we put into this, because we do our homework. It's our responsibility to make sure that we go out there and inform. And as we inform people, we try to stay up to date on some very good topics. I know we do a lot of sports, and I look forward to, as our platform continues to grow together, not only are we going to be adept at sports, but I want to find some other news subjects. Before we close out the broadcast, I got to tell you something that I really think about all the time. And as we started doing these broadcasts before, I remember the one episode I'll never forget about when Martina McBride, remember that one? Concrete Angel?
That was a very powerful episode.
Yeah, and I think, to me, that during these times when we go through adversity, I like to bring up certain specific episodes, because we need to make sure that there's enough positivity going on. And with all everything that's going on in terms of people not using common sense to stay healthy, I still like to address certain things like this for those individuals out there that we have a soft spot. you know, as much as this COVID-19 is forcing us to stay inside, appreciate the family that you have, okay? You know, unfortunately, my mother has come down with COPD and is dealing with a myriad of medical conditions. I want to send my prayers out to my mother. She's a real warrior in every sense of the word. Thankfully, my dad got only a cancer scare, but he was misdiagnosed. God, and I hope my dad can continue to be in good frame. But enjoy your family while you've got them. You really need to do that. My mother, what a sweetheart she is. She tries as hard as she can to promote our programs. And more importantly, try to find the good in people, not the bad, because it's so easy to go in the other way. And I know you've been in the news industry, see a lot of it out there. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to kind of bring that out there and shed a little bit of light. So any closing thoughts about the broadcast, Xavier McKnight?
You know, this has definitely been fun. This has been great. And, you know, we're going to continue to bring this content and bring everything we can for you guys and continue to give you guys the best show that we can. You know, once again, rest in peace to everyone that we've lost with this battle and many other battles. And congratulations to all those Hall of Famers who are going in this weekend. Prayers up for everybody who's battling everything right now, including Scott's mother and so many other people as well. And, you know, let's just get ready for the next few weeks when this docuseries will be coming out, because I can tell you for a fact I will be glued to my TV.
Well, I'll tell you what, Xavier, I'll be very curious to see what you'll be cooking in the kitchen, because if the next show is as good as this one, we'll be in great shape. And if it isn't, we'll continue to make them good. But this was a really good one, as they always are. And I'm very proud that you are able to dig deep within to come up with some outstanding things to talk about. So on behalf of Xavier McKnight, this is Scott Morganroth, the Motor City Madmouth, telling everybody to please be safe. Don't take the route that some of these old spring breakers did down here and self-destruct. It's not worth it. We don't want you to be part of the wrong statistic. So meanwhile, everybody have a good weekend, and we will catch you next time on The Real and the Rare. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.